Hello, and welcome back to the Calm and Connected podcast. I'm your host, Janine Halloran, and on today's podcast, I have a special treat for you. I started recently running a guest speaker webinar series, and back in December, I interviewed Dr. Rebecca Jackson. She is the Chief Programs Officer at Brain Balance and is a celebrated expert in brain health and optimization. And she wrote the book called Back on Track. And as I was reading it, I thought she would be a fantastic guest speaker to help us figure out strategies we can use to help get our kids and teens development back on track, and in particular back on track after the pandemic. I know that a lot of people have a lot of big concerns about that, and so she's written a book that really dedicates a lot of energy and time and research into what are the things that we can do to help our kids get back on track in terms of their emotional development, in terms of their attention, in terms of their learning. So we had a really wonderful conversation, and I'm sharing a piece of it with you just so you get a taste of what the guest speaker series is all about. The whole hour interview is available at the Coping Skills Hub, so I hope you enjoy our conversation. I want to take a moment and introduce Dr. Rebecca Jackson, the Chief Programs Officer at Brain Balance. She is a celebrated expert in brain health and optimization. So at Brain Balance, she drives programmatic enhancements and creates new programs to meet the growing demands of people wanting to achieve more for themselves and their children. As the author of the new book, Back on Track, see all my little tabs? She's a media fixture featured in respected outlets like the Mayo Clinic Press, Forbes, Psych Central, and Business Insider. And she's been a guest on The Doctor Show and NBC's Nightly News. So thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thanks, Janine. I always love our conversation. So thrilled to be here.
Oh my goodness. So I mentioned that you are the Chief Programs Officer at Brain Balance, but for people who don't know what Brain Balance is, this is new to them. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So Brain Balance is a program for both kids and adults that's focused on strengthening aspects of the brain to minimize complications. And we do that through a really layered, comprehensive, integrative approach. So we're a non-medical approach to strengthen the brain to reduce symptoms. So combinations of wearing lots of different pieces of sensory gear while exercising core muscles, rhythm and timing, your visual system, doing lots of different eye exercises and movements, also working auditory processing and visual processing. The goal is to really strengthen those networks and pathways in the brain to make the brain stronger, faster, more efficient, and have better endurance. And when that's the case, we're able to pay attention for longer, to do better at blocking out distractions, to do better at managing our mood and emotions during times of frustration. So and I get to, in that role, work on the programs as well as the research. So what we see is consistent change in the areas that I mentioned, as reported by teachers, clinicians, parents, through diagnostic measures and more. So it's meaningful change through a comprehensive program.
Thank you so much for explaining that. It's so fascinating to me to think about strengthening the brain from those sorts of ways of doing it. And I remember as I was reading through the book, it's one of the developmental pieces and understanding how development impacts our brain and our learning and our capabilities, and thinking about a child not necessarily by age in terms of their development, but where they are along development and then bringing them to the next level. Yeah?
100%. And this is, something that's so interesting to me in working with so many parents and families over the years. We have the child sitting in front of us, right? And it's so easy to focus on the pain point, the frustration of not being able to make it through a family dinner without a meltdown, or phone calls from school, or spending so much time on homework and having it be such a frustrating time. Whatever the thing is, it's so easy to focus on the symptom. But really, from my perspective, what I love to do is take a step back to say, why is that symptom there? We can have 10 kids and 2 of whom might have an anxiety response to the same event. And why? What's the difference? And the more we really dig into the brain, the more we understand that it's our natural development that leads towards our executive function abilities, our ability to manage our mood and responses. So our expectations for a 2-year-old in terms of attention and behavior is very different than a 6-year-old. And it's that natural trajectory of development that brings a 2-year-old to be able to pay attention for longer and not have tantrums over every little thing when they can't put their socks on by themselves. So what we see is, and this can be so frustrating and confusing for parents, because you might have this 10-year-old sitting in front of you that might be older than age appropriate in some aspects of development. Maybe their memory is off the charts, and you can have such interesting and in-depth conversations with them. And then a few minutes later, they might feel like a 6-year-old when they're frustrated and upset. And so understanding that development doesn't always happen in a unified, equal manner across the board. And I see parents that confuses them. And then they can also minimize things where they'll say, yeah, maybe she struggles with friends, but she's so smart. Both things can be true. And so we want to understand, what can we do to help get development back on track so that we're naturally building those pathways, so that whatever the curriculum is, whatever the coping strategy is, or whatever we're trying to teach them, you're teaching those things to a more age appropriate brain that's more able to apply what we're learning. So for me, it goes back to development, and it is true for both kids and adults. Our adult ability to function is dependent on how our brain came together. And the beautiful thing is, the brain can change at any age. And so it's not too late, even for those of us older on the call.
Yes, absolutely. There's flexibility in our brain. We can learn, we can grow, we can change. And I see the same thing that you mentioned about the differences in different parts of a child's development. When you sit and you're in a meeting and you're talking, just even something as simple as like the difference between how they can do in reading versus math, and they can be very varied, and that's okay. It's understanding who is the child in front of you, what are the things that they're very good at, what are the things that we still need to work on, and how can we help them continue to grow and develop. And what I think a lot of times I was hearing about, especially since the pandemic, was okay, so now we have this moment of time, this period of time where our kids really were, it was different, it was difficult, it was challenging, it was hard, and it has impacted our development. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what inspired you to write Back on Track.
Like you, I would describe myself as a reluctant author. It wasn't, I didn't wake up one day and say, gosh, I want to write a book. But during that time, the number of media requests coming in saying, talk about this, what is this going to do to impact our kids? And so I found myself talking about these same things and writing articles about these same things over and over and over. So it was just very present on my mind. And then at the same time, we were watching a huge escalation of parents calling into Brain Balance saying, can you help? What's going on? Why am I seeing this? What can I do about it? Is this something that can be changed and addressed? And for so many of the families reaching out, they were already doing the traditional things in terms of, medication or counseling. And if that wasn't doing the trick, they were just feeling stuck and didn't know what else to do. And then for me personally, I tend to be a glass half full, positive, optimistic person, and news headlines are always negative, but the negativity around the challenge during that time just was getting to me. So the constant headlines of increase in ADHD, increase in anxiety, depression, and suicide in our kids, increase in the academic achievement gap, and it's getting bigger. And I kept sitting there thinking, yes, all of this is true, but where's the hope in the action plan? We know all of this. What are we going to do about it? And I kept waiting for that conversation, and it wasn't happening. So finally I thought, okay, I don't have all the answers, but I've got some insights and understanding from the work that I've done over these past, 15 years with Brain Balance. And so I wanted to jump in and join and lead that conversation if it wasn't happening, to say, okay, parents, let's give you a better understanding as to why you're seeing what you're seeing. How do we learn from this time? What can you do from home that are actionable steps? And I'll say, a book is never a replacement for a full comprehensive program, but the book is an accessible starting point for everybody. I want to always provide understanding, hope, and an action plan.
Yeah, and you know what was so interesting, being a reluctant writer myself, it's one of those things where you want to be able to put some good support out into the world, and it's like you just feel a little bit nervous about, maybe like, am I should I be the one who's writing this? Are there other people who could write it? And then it becomes, well, actually, I do have a lot of knowledge and expertise and information that could be really helpful as a jumping off point for people. And if they want to get more information, they can go further and look deeper into the things that I've mentioned and figure out what's going to work for them. And that's what I really loved about the book, is that it was, you divide it up into different sort of areas of development, but then within each area of development, there's a moment where you are talking about, um, you know, younger kid development, middle school and high, like elementary and then middle school, high school, which I appreciate as somebody who works with all those age ranges. I like to be able to make sure that we can cover and talk about all the different strategies that could be useful, especially for like middle school, high school. I think a lot of times we tend to focus on the little ones. We focus a lot on the elementary school kids, but the big kids, they also need help too. And it's not too late. I think a lot of times people think, oh, they're a teenager, it's too late. No, it's not. It's absolutely not too late. You can absolutely intervene and do things. And I love the simple sort of ideas that you give, and simple strategies, simple sort of takeaways that people can use. But then also, how do you know that something has changed? How do you know it's getting better? That's at the end of every chapter, which I really appreciate. Like, what kind of things will I see when I know that it's getting better? And it's not like night and day. It's gradual change, right? Just as all development is. It's just like a gradual sort of difference that you notice over time.
It is. It's watching the grass grow, and one day you wake up and think, "Oh my gosh, I needed to mow the lawn a week ago." And you're so right on describing that emotional roller coaster of writing a book. Of you start fired up with so much energy and excitement of, "Oh my gosh, I just want to share this information," and then you go through that. Who am I to be the one talking about this? But I did really feel like it wasn't being talked about enough. And I certainly don't have all the answers, but I've been so fortunate to get to work with such incredible people throughout my career that I constantly am learning from. And so I felt like I wanted to be able to share what I was learning that was exciting me and meant a lot to me as a parent. And it was just the questions that I was answering over and over for friends, for family, for the parents at Brain Balance. And then, like you, it was also the book that I wanted for my own kids who are teenagers now that I didn't have. And something that always struck me is there are so many great resources out there of what development looks like through pregnancy and through up till age 2. What to expect when you're expecting practically walks you through, week by week, day by day, how an infant is developing in utero. And then we know exactly what to expect in terms of gross motor, fine motor communication milestones in our toddlers. And then we stop talking about those things. And maybe it's because we get super busy as parents and we're running the kids everywhere and trying to feed them and juggle all the things. But we get asked all the time, is this normal? Should I worry? Is this okay? And we get asked that in not just about body coordination and communication, but in how kids form relationships, how kids learn their attention abilities. And so I wanted to provide what developmental milestones look like for infant and toddlers, for our elementary school kids and our middle school, high school kids, in what does learning look like for a high schooler and a middle school schooler? What does attention look like? What does anxiety and handling upsets look like? And trying to give parents that insight of, okay, there's challenge with each stage of development. That's normal. That's okay. It's a part of it. Anxiety is a natural part of a development, but you worry when it's too much and sticks around for too long. So trying to give parents, and it's my hope is it's a book that you don't sit down and read cover to cover the first moment, but it's a book that you refer back to over time and look at the checklist to say, okay, I've got a 10-year-old who is functioning like a 12-year-old here and an 8-year-old here and a 7-year-old here. And you come back and you look at the book again 6 months later and realize, oh, wow, we really have made progress here, even though I'm getting some pushback and some, striving for independence, hoping to help parents see that sometimes some of those challenges are positive signs of growth and development. And sometimes there's signs that we need to step in and do more to springboard that development to get it back on track.
Absolutely. And one thing that I've been noticing a lot is a lot of sensory sort of challenges coming up. Just in my work with children, sensory is something that's coming up a lot. And so I was really interested to read the sensory development chapter. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the connection between sensory input and emotional development, because I found that fascinating.
It's fascinating to me as well. And again, having worked with sensory with kids for 15 years, the more I learn about it, the more I understand how truly powerful and significant and important it is for all of us at every age. Our senses is how we interact with the world. And if there's any disruption or dysregulation in our sensory input, we learn through our senses. It's how we listen and see, and it's what grounds us and orients us in the world. So our senses provide us relationship interactions, learning. Our senses are everything. And when there's disruption in our sensory processing, now our brain is getting inconsistent information, which can lead to reduction in attention, increase in anxiety, disruption in learning. And one of the I always call it my mind bomb, just a mind boggling, fascinating moment for me, was I was actually on a phone call with the neurology professor from UNC at Chapel Hill, and we were having a really interesting conversation. And he said, hey, have you read this study? And so he sent over the study. He's like, you're going to just love it. And the study was looking at how the three primary sensory pathways of sight, touch, and sound lead to the maturation of our emotional circuitry. Sight, touch, and sound matures our emotional regulation. So it makes so much sense. It was like, oh my gosh, I've seen this play out over and over again, but to say it that way. So when I've got a child that is melting down too much, too big, too often, that's actually a red flag that there might be something going on in their sensory system. And, as parents and professionals, it's so easy to jump to the symptom, to say, okay, they're melting down all the time. What's my behavior strategy? What's my distraction technique? But that's actually, and all of those things are necessary and important and needed. But at the same time as we're putting in that strategy, what can I be doing to mature and change the brain so that we're providing varied and repetition in sensory input so that we're maturing the pathways that process information and control our reactions. So we want to improve the way the brain takes in, processes, and responds to information so we can be more effective in any environment. So the senses are everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I really appreciated was understanding interoception and getting that understanding of how do you understand how you're feeling, and the connection with interoception, like to be able to make that understanding of, okay, this is how I'm feeling, which is a huge part of self-regulation, to be able to name your feeling, right? And the connection between just the sensory piece of understanding how you feel and that connection with emotional development.
It's huge, and it's so hard. It's something that I work on as myself as an adult who knows a little bit about the brain, is that being aware of what you're feeling and what you're experiencing, because when you're tuned into that, it can give you directional guidance. So something that I work on, again, with my own kids who are in 8th and 10th grade currently, is cluing into your mood, what that tells you about your brain state in that moment. And one of the things I'm a broken record on saying, and my kids, I'm sure, roll their eyes every time I say it, but a tired brain is a negative brain. So if, my son is sitting down to do math homework and he's in that, grouchy, I can't do this. This is stupid. I'm never going to use this. This is too hard. If he's in that moment, to be able to say, hey, Drew, I see right now that you're super negative, and I can tell in your body posture that you are so frustrated. When your brain is negative like that, you're not using your high level brain capacity, which means you're going to have a harder time accessing memory. You're going to have a harder time paying attention. So when you're negative, your brain is functioning in lower parts of the brain, which means you're functioning in the here and now. You can't plan, you can't make decisions. You're not going to be accessing memory as effectively. So when we're doing homework in a really negative state, that's not going to be as effective. And so, hey, that tells me we need to take a break. Maybe a little bit of movement to re-engage and fire up the brain in a more positive state. Do we need a snack, some protein, carbohydrates to give you some fuel so that you can focus? But cluing that in to say, you're negative, it's going to make things harder right now. What can we do to change it? And I try to apply that to myself. I think about, I drive my kids to school in the morning, There's the mornings where I'm happy as can be. And then there's the mornings where they're driving me nuts and I'm like this close to losing my temper, or I do, they're running late. They forgot their track spikes and they're being grouchy to me. And I get up early to drive them, like, come on. And when I find myself in that irritable, losing my cool, I take a step back and say, okay, if I'm negative right now, what can I do to change it? And what does that tell me? Am I stressed? Do I have a lot going on at work? And what can I do to modulate that stress, to calm me down? Do I need to get some exercise that morning to snap out of it? So that interoception, that awareness of how we're feeling, tells us what part of our brain are we using? Am I going to be effective today? Am I going to be less effective? Am I going to have a hard time focusing? And then trying to teach and model and share that information with our kids so that hopefully they can apply it in their own lives.
And I think there's also that piece of the practice of pausing, because it's hard to sometimes, in the midst of being tired and driving to school, because I'm there too, when somebody misses the bus and we have to get driven to school because things just did not go smoothly in the morning. So I take that pause and say, what can I do in my life in the next, couple of minutes and over the next day? How can I make a change so that I can access more positive sort of places to be versus staying in that negative space? Because that's really easy. It's very easy to go negative and stay there, right?
I
But
need to practice the pause as well. That's really good advice. Thank you, Janine.
the pause is hard. The
It's
pause
so
is really
hard.
hard. And it's hard to, like, and just in teaching everything, like the teaching emotional regulation, to pause is a huge part of it, and it's hard to do for adults, so it's hard to do for our little ones as well. But I
Thinking about the neurology of the pause, that's break and impulse control. And so the more immature we are with our development, the harder it is to pause. And if we're tired, stressed, anxious, upset, again, we've dropped back down to here. So we're going to have a harder time implementing the pause. So the more upset we are, the harder it's going to be to pause, which is when we need it the most.
and Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that you were mentioning was movement. And so I love the chapter on attention, because I work with a lot of kids who have attention challenges. And one thing I found really interesting was the snow angel exercise. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that is helpful?
Yeah, you're bringing up some of my favorite chapters from the book, so I love it that they resonated with you as well. So something that's always been really interesting to me is understanding, again, how development happens. And what we know, if I were to say what are the two biggest drivers of development in kids, it's movement and our sensory system. And so movement, using our core muscles and body coordination and timing, that's what's taking simple networks and pathways in the brain and making them more complex, that ultimately leads to our executive functions. So, and this is different in kids than adults. For adults, we're able to sit still and focus. I don't need movement as an adult to pay attention. However, when my attention starts to wander and I start to get fatigued, what I do to re-engage my attention is I move. Now, when it comes to kids, and again, the younger you are developmentally, the more a child needs to move to pay attention, because when they activate their muscles, it's increasing the level of alertness of their brain. And then we put a 6-year-old in school and say, sit still, hold still, pay attention. We're handling this counterintuitively for what the brain needs. The young brain needs movement to pay attention. And so, if you're working with a child and they're needing to pace or walk around or bounce on an exercise ball, it doesn't mean that they're not paying attention. Their body might need that. So there's a developmental reflex, which is where I'm getting back to the snow angel part of things. There's a developmental reflex that babies should be born with, that as the brain matures, the brain learns how to override that reflex. It inhibits that reflex. And what that reflex does is it triggers movement. And so when we have a child that hasn't learned, their brain hasn't overridden or inhibited that reflex, when their back is stimulated, they're naturally going to move. So we put a child that has immaturity and development in a chair and tell them to hold still. And then they sit back and the back of the chair touches their back and they can't control it. Their body's going to reflexively move. And then they're going to wiggle even more to help them pay attention. And so it's understanding that. So it's tough because now we're asking a child to control something you can't control, a reflex. So we're asking a child to control something they can't control. So at that point, we want to go back in. We want to mature that reflex so that those higher brain functions are inhibiting it. So it begins to give them more control, which again is then going to lead to the development of the more complex pathways that ultimately will get them to a point of being able to hold still and pay attention. But it goes back to that old adage of sit up to pay attention. That's 100% true. When we engage our core muscles, it increases the alertness and activation of our brain.
I hope you enjoyed that part of my conversation with Dr. Rebecca Jackson. As I mentioned, the whole interview can be watched at the Coping Skills Hub, along with a list of resources that we discussed during the conversation. The guest speaker series is happening every month, so in November, I actually interviewed Dr. Dawn Huebner all about anxiety and specific phobias, and that interview is also available in the Hub, and I have more lined up for 2024. So for instance, coming on January 29th at 1 p.m., I'm talking with Caroline McGuire. She will be speaking with us about her book, Why Will No One Play With Me? The Play Better plan to help children of all ages make friends and thrive. So there's a link to sign up for that event in the show notes, and I would love to see you all there. It's always an opportunity to get a chance to speak with the guest and actually ask them questions live, which I think is really fun to be able to do. And it's the way I put it out there is like an extended podcast where we actually have people live with us. So I always enjoy doing those, and I've been having some fun. So I'm lining up some more people to come in and join us and speak with us on lots of different topics. And thank you all so much for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate it. If you like this podcast, feel free to share it with your friends or colleagues, or give it a rating and review wherever you listen. And as always, don't forget about yourself. Take a few minutes, have a little fun, and have an awesome day.